Hello. Today we're going to talk about HTML forms. Now, the last slide has some HTML5 stuff on it, but most of what we're talking about is the way that forms have worked for quite some time now. HTML is an interesting entity because it's always changing. Sometimes there's major revisions like HTML5, and sometimes there's just minor revisions where basically things get deprecated over time, which means they go away. Sometimes new things are coming about. It's a constantly changing landscape, and so we're going to look at what I think you're going to need to create just about any form that you would ever want to create. Most forms on the web are pretty simple. We're going to look at some of the more advanced types. Not terribly advanced. They're all stuff that you've seen before, but most forms are pretty simple. Whether we're talking about a simple Google search or signing up for some kind of a list, forms are everywhere. They are what allow users like you and I to exchange information with a web page. So let's start our tour here. This also is meant to accompany the lab, which we completed this week in class. The lab is where I'm going to show you the more practical examples. This is just going to be me talking about it, so do understand that the PowerPoint and the lab, in conjunction, they kind of add up to the content for the week. This is just more of a discussion. I'll show you a couple examples. So let's start off with the form tag. So a form is going to be something that you're going to find in the body of some HTML. It's a big old container tag. Well, it's probably big, depending on how many elements are in the form. A form needs to have two attributes. Could have more. Depending on what you're doing with it, I guess it could have less, but in PHP it needs to have two. And so we're defining things in the context of PHP. If this was JavaScript world, things would be a little bit different, but we're talking about PHP. So the two things it needs an action and it needs a method. I will tell you what those things do. The action is the name of the script which processes the form. I also want to mention, I meant to say this a minute ago, you might be kind of annoyed that I'm not using presentation mode, but I'm going to be going back and forth between examples in my PowerPoint, so sorry about all this junk over here. You're just going to have to see it. Alright, so the action, this is the name of the script which processes the form. We have not learned how to process a form yet, so you don't need to worry much about it. Oftentimes you just put nothing in there, or put a pound sign in there, right? Some kind of a false property, but ultimately that is the name of the script which processes the form. The method, we actually will talk about this today. So the method is, this defines how you are passing the information. So a form has information that the user enters on it, and the method determines how that information is passed. I will demonstrate that in a couple minutes. So you got to have those two things if you're going to actually do something with your form in PHP. We haven't talked about how to process anything, so you don't need to care a whole lot about the action and the method, but do know that those things need to be there, otherwise you're not going to be able to process this form with PHP. You've got two options, get and post. We'll discuss those soon enough. So a form is made up of a bunch of inputs. They can have different types. There's quite a variety of types. Inputs are a void tag, which means there's not an opening and a closing tag. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the opening input tag and the closing input tag. No such thing as a closing input tag. I'm pretty sure I've done a closing input tag about 100 times, but it doesn't do anything. Inputs need attributes to basically define what they are. So the most important one's probably the type. Type defines what kind of an input it is. So most inputs are text boxes. I don't know the answer to this. I'm just making things up. But I would bet you that on the internet, probably 75% of the inputs are probably just text. Right? That's just a standard text box. Right? It's the kind of thing. I'll point at one later. I don't want to go to an example every single time I bring something up. Otherwise, this will go twice as long as it needs to. It's just a standard text box. Now, when I say it's worthless without a type, that's not entirely true. If you just do an input without a type, it's going to default to a text box. So I guess you don't really ever need to write type equals text. And so it's kind of the debate we get to real early in the class, and that is, well, should you write something that you don't need to write? Well, I'm not going to mark it down for it, I guess. I guess it's nothing but inefficient if this is just going to be assumed to be the case. But there's a part of me that's actually a programmer, and I know it's just sloppy to not document things, so I always write type equals text, but it's not wrong to not write it, but it will default to that. A very similar one is password. You've seen a password field. It looks exactly like a text box. The difference is that the characters on the screen are just those little bullets instead, right? I mean, if you're putting in a password, it shouldn't display it on the screen. And another very, very common one is submit, right? Which seems different. Those are those buttons on the bottom of the form that you press it and then the form does something. I call those super basic because those three right there, I would bet you that this is probably well upwards of 90% of the inputs on the internet. Beyond that, you don't need really many of the others. Oftentimes they add polish to a website, but those are the core ones. So some other attributes you need. If you're going to be writing PHP, which we are, you're going to need a name attribute. That's going to be, basically, if you want to think of it like that's the name of the variable. That it will make sense at some point, but the data that you're passing relies on the name. The value, you don't need that. It kind of depends on the input we're talking about, but the value is the default text of the thing. So where this comes into play is on like a button. If you have the value of a button and it says go, then the button's going to say go. So you don't need to use the value, but that's what it does. Size would set a literal length of the field, and a label is related to an input, kind of, sort of, but also not. You don't need labels necessarily, but a label is a container tag. It's an inline element by default, and this is a way I use a lot of these to style the kind of the hint field for the input. Inputs by themselves are just like a circle or a checkbox or a text box. If you don't have text in front of it, then the user's not going to know what goes in there, and that's where labels come into play. You don't need labels, but they are a little bit helpful. I'm going to go pull up a page and show you, what things look like, right? So here's a text box, good example of a text box, right? Nothing special about it. That's the label, right? Without a label, it's just a text box, and you'd be like, well, what's supposed to go there? A password, let me show you the difference. It's an awful lot like a text box, but there's those bullets that I was telling you about, right? So not displayed on the screen. That's all we've talked about so far. So text, password, labels, and that's a submit button. Back to the PowerPoint. So the next part of the tour, we're going to talk about that passing data. So get versus post. I can illustrate this for you, but you don't need to care a whole lot right now. So this is the method of the form. I told you there's get and there's post. I always use capitals. Web browsers don't care how you write this. My best advice for you is always do all caps. There's a good reason for it. I'll try and explain that in a minute here. So this determines how it's passed. Let me just show you it in practice. So here's a form, and notice the get method is what we're using. I'm going to show you how that works out. Sorry, it's a little clunky, but it has to be. I'm going to submit this form. I want you to have a look up here at the URL. All right, see that URL? It's pretty long. It's just got this big ugly file path because it's local. But when I press submit, I want you to see what happens to that URL. Whoa, right? A whole bunch of stuff. So this part didn't actually change. What happened is there's now a question mark, and it says uname equals Ken, pass equals Ken, ship equals express, CLR equals white, remember me equals on, or I think that's what that says. Yep. Comments equals hello. So if you want to try and connect the dots of what happened is, remember all that stuff I had entered in the form? Well, all that stuff I put in the form after I pressed submit went up to the URL. So when I'm talking about how we're passing data, that's what the get method does. When you have the method of your form set to get, all that information gets passed via the URL. That looks pretty sloppy, but that's a very common way to pass information. If you set the method of the form to post, then it will not display that information up in the URL. It gets passed, it just gets passed differently. It gets passed using headers. So it's like invisible if you use post. Now you might be wondering, well, is post better than get because it's invisible? It's not unsightly. One problem with what I had previously was my password was just sitting up there in the URL, which seems like a problem. So it is true that a get method would not be appropriate if you had a password, which you were trying to send. So in a sense, post is better than get, but the problem with a post is that it's really hard to debug because the information is just kind of passed behind the scenes. You're going to make a lot of mistakes when you're passing information and deciphering information, so I always advise you to just always start out with gets and then just At the point where you're ready to take that form and put it online, I do a find and replace, and I just find and replace all my gets and turn them into posts. And that's why I use caps. If you use all caps, then your find and replace is going to work better. Remember I said you should do that a couple minutes ago. If you use lowercase, who knows? What if you have a variable called get, or you do some kind of a partial match, like the word target or something? So I always do all caps. It's easier to do a find and replace. There's nothing wrong with get, just so you understand. Most information on the web is passed via get. Just you just have to be a little bit careful about it. There's some special things that you can only do with post, and there's situations like a password where post is definitely the right choice. But don't get the idea in your head that get is wrong, because it's not wrong. Alright, so that is pretty important. That determines how the information's passed. You kind of saw it in practice. I promise you, I can't demo everything because it would just take forever. But if I change that into a post, then none of that stuff would be visible in the URL. It would still exist, it just wouldn't be so visible. Alright, trust me, this thing gets going a little bit faster. So, submit, reset button. I talked about submit button a little bit. It's a type, it's an input. The value is what gives it the text on the button. By default, it says something like submit form. But if you want to say something other than the default, then you give it a value. Most inputs don't really have a value, but a button does. Just so you know, another type of button, so this doesn't, it's not type submit, it's not type reset, but if you do input type image, it's going to act like a button. And the src, that would be the address of the image. So this is useful. This is the one thing I plan to Google for you. For an example of that, right, like most submit buttons look something like that, and you can style them up with CSS however you want, but like a quick Google search of images, if I do image button, you see stuff like that, right? There's certain things you might want to have something which acts like a button, which is technically an image. I don't do a whole lot of that because I'm not really a design guy, right? Like things like that, but you can. Just while we're talking about buttons, we might as well talk about that. A reset button is something you may have never seen before. It's similar to submit, right? Like input type equals submit would be a submit button. A reset button clears out all the fields on the form. It's a pretty annoying button potentially, but you should know it exists because it definitely kind of fits into that same discussion. So formatting forms, these are things that don't do anything for the form, but we'll talk about the significance. A field set basically is used to make it clear to the user that things are related. Like, for example, if you had a bunch of radio buttons and you wanted to make it clear that those three, you need to choose one of the three, that would be a good choice. IDs are used by JavaScript a lot, and they're used by CSS a lot. They are not used a lot for PHP. We use them oftentimes in conjunction with labels because we use them to bind them. You'll get a feel for that. There's no way you won't get a feel for that when you work through the lab for this week. But IDs aren't the most important thing in PHP. They're very important for CSS and oftentimes JavaScript, but not the most important thing for PHP. Now let's talk about checkboxes. So checkbox is just a different type. It's still an input. A checkbox is appropriate when you've got something that may or may not be checked. It's also useful when you've got like, say you had 10 options and it was okay to check 5 of them, right? So when it's okay to do 0 or multiple, a checkbox is the right tool. Required is kind of an interesting attribute. This isn't really related to checkboxes as much as it is anything which is selectable. This is what enforces, it will ensure that the checkbox is checked, or the radio button, or whatever we're talking about. It'll make sure that it is non-blank when the form is submitted. Here's an example of a checkbox with a name of OK and a value of yes, and this is saying it better be checked, otherwise the form won't submit. I'll show you what all these things look like in a minute. It only makes sense to show you checkboxes and radio buttons at the same time. Radio buttons are quite similar to checkboxes, but the significant thing with them is they have a really important name attribute. So if you had a bunch of radio buttons, let's say there were 10 of them, and they all had the same name, then that would mean that they are all part of the same group, meaning that you can select at least one of them. The different values come from that. So now that I've talked about that, let me show it to you in practice. So here's my form. So these are radio buttons. Notice I'm only allowed to check one at a time. When I select one, it unselects the others because they're all in the same group. These are checkboxes, right? In a checkbox, you can have one or none selected. All right, I'm sorry, more than one or none. And that one is required. Let me show you what required looks like. If you try and submit something and it's not checked and it's required, then it's going to yell at you and it's not going to allow you to submit the form. That required attribute can be applied to other elements as well. This is just a good example of it. All right, so checkboxes, you can have none or lots of them. A radio button, you can only have one, right? And I can't deselect it. Doesn't matter how many times I click on it. So fundamentally, they're different. You just have to put some thought into what's the right control for the situation that I'm doing. All right, select option. I guess you could call this the most complicated one because it's the only one with a container tag. So this is used for a drop-down set of selections. Typically, when you're doing a select option or an option select, you will only have one thing selected in that drop-down list. There is a multiple attribute which allows you to allow the user to select multiple, but I don't typically do that. I think if I wanted the user to be able to select more than one thing or just one thing, I would probably just go with checkboxes. This is not the easiest thing to process. It's realistic. I mean, you could have the multiple attribute, but it's not super common. So here's how this works. You've got a big old select tag. It's the container tag. The name is important because that's how it's going to be passed up in the URL if we're using a get method. And these are the different values. Notice they're grouped because they sit, whereas like radio buttons are grouped by the name, option select are grouped just by falling in between those two select tags. These are also container tags, right, which makes them a little bit different. That part right there is the part that gets displayed on the screen. That is the value that gets passed behind the scenes. Let me show you an option select. These are real useful. Right, that's an option select with two values in it. Almost done here. The last one's a text area. Text areas are when you need something that's larger than a text box. It is a container tag, which seems a little weird, but it is. Format looks kind of like this. The attributes that you commonly set for this are rows and calls. Rows is how tall it is. Calls is how wide it is. I don't have a ton to tell you about that. I'll show it to you, though, because it's the last thing on our tour. Right, that's the text area. So this is useful for like comments or something like that. And then that's everything I want to talk about. Those are your tools that you need to create pretty much any kind of form on the web. Beyond that, you're getting into some kind of realm of advanced types. So on the idea of advanced types, let's talk about a couple of them. So I kind of ended the useful part of the lecture right there, but let's talk about HTML5 form controls. So HTML5 is a couple years old now. With HTML5, they realized just how prevalent forms were on the web and how validation is necessary and how additional types would be good. So they created more types like URL, tel, email, date, color. The thing that you need to understand about HTML5 form controls, so anything like those ones I showed you before, you could use those in any browser and they're going to go just fine. These, you need to understand that modern browsers are probably going to do okay with most of these types, but older browsers are going to ignore them completely, which means that they're just not reliable. And it's just not legitimate to create web pages and forms which only work right for some people. I mean, you're free to do it, but I'm not going to tell you that I think it's a good idea. So let me show you, just for example, what one of these things looks like, just because I think we can have a quick discussion about it. Date and color are probably the cool ones. So let me show you what one of those would look like. Here's my form. I have my right arm in a sling, so I'm going to pause the video and I'll do it and show you what it looks like. Alright, so I added two inputs. I mean, this is absolute hackism right here. That's just, I didn't give them names, I didn't give them IDs, I didn't give them labels. I just want to show you what they do. So I did a date, I did a color. So I'm going to save that. Now I'm going to go back to that sample web page I've been showing you. I'm going to refresh this. And so those are the two new fields. This also illustrates the issue of if you have a field without a label on it, like what are you supposed to do with it? Right? What is this thing? Well, right, I'm not too worried about it because it illustrates a problem. But if I click on it, like notice nothing happens, right? Nothing. That's kind of frustrating. Like I said, those new types don't work in all browsers, but that one, that's a color. So I click on color and it does that. That's pretty cool. I can't say I've ever legitimately created a form which needed a color field, but that's pretty cool, right? Works great. So what the heck's with this one? Well, just understand that those are not reliable. There will be a day when probably all those types are reliable, but that day is not today. Let me show you a different trick. So let's go run. Let me try and run it in Chrome. Chrome's an excellent environment for testing a web page. So here's what my form looks like in Chrome. So notice the color field. Sorry, I don't know what it's lagging about, but we'll talk. The color field worked in both browsers, but notice when I click on the date, I get that thing, which is pretty awesome. That's what you call a date picker. But as cool as that is, right? And there's all kinds of ways you can configure that. I want to point out that notice it did not work in Firefox. Firefox is a pretty good browser. Your best choice for web development should be Chrome, but you can't just shut your eyes to the real world and just pretend that everyone uses Chrome. What if you built a form asking people for their birth date, and their birth date was really important to your site, and you're completely relying on this thing to pop up, and then they go to the site in Firefox, person like myself, right, and they don't get any help with it. So I think that proved the point which I wanted to prove, which was that these new HTML5 fields, they're not reliable. I've used the term validate a little bit. Validate is when you're trying to enforce the integrity of data on a form. So things like telephones and such, basically, or like an email, basically how those work, they don't have cool things popping up. But if you enter something like an email address without an @ in it, for example, it will yell at the user and tell them that it's not formatted correctly. So these things do different things. Sometimes they pop up a cool visual assistance tool, and sometimes they just help to validate the information. As cool as these are, just realize that they are not the solution to all of your problems. So that's just about everything that you'll need to know about forms, probably to do just about everything that you'd ever want to create on the web. Now, processing forms and validating forms, those are much larger discussions, but in terms of everything that you'll need to ever create a form, that's probably about it, or at least for the time being. As I said, HTML is something that's always growing and shrinking, so I'm sure there'll be new things in the future, but as of now, it's a pretty accurate depiction of the tools that you'll need. So thank you for watching. Good luck with the rest of the week.